Skeeter get to work.
Yes. Now, it's a pleasure for us to sit with Mr. Clyde Payton this morning to review his personal history in blacksmithing. And I hope that he's going to review for us how he got interested and what he's been doing these 7 or 8 years that he's been hammering iron. That's not to say that that reflects his age, because I'm aware that he's been hammering iron at least 70 years. And I pray that he will review for us some of that. We are at his home, at his personal desk, sitting inside of his house on August the 9th, 1914. Mr. Payton.
1914?
Thank you, Mr.
You're a little
Payton.
behind there.
Now, I was talking about the date that you were born.
Oh, okay.
But today's date is 2014. And looking at the clock on his desk, it is 25 minutes after 10 a.m. in the morning.
Anno Domini.
Anno Dominique. And we are at a blacksmith gathering at his house, and there's a demonstration going on in his very equipped, marvelous blacksmith shop sitting to the back of his residence. Mr. Payton, it's a pleasure for us to be here. We're trying to record the history of Florida blacksmithing. And we're aware that you are a charter member of the Florida Artists Blacksmith Association.
Yep.
Which makes you then among the fathers of our organization. It's a pleasure for us to be here. Please tell us how it is that you got involved with, how come you ever got interested in hammering hot iron?
Well, Dr. Prather, I really can't zero in on any specific time. My interest in working metal really goes back to my early childhood. My great grandfather, who was a farmer, had a very modest blacksmith shop that he used to repair and sharpen his own tools.
Yes.
My grandfather had a lac shop. He was also a farmer, a peach farmer, and he had a very modest blacksmith shop also. And as a small child, I remember pilfering around in his blacksmith shop and turning his hand-turned bellows or blower,
Yes.
forge. But I never did really get into making a fire or getting metal hot.
Did you burn yourself?
Oh, the first time.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh, well, you were initiated.
Yes, I was initiated very early in that respect. So anyway, my confrontation with blacksmithing, or my contamination with blacksmithing, happened at a very early age. And that interest magnified and amplified quite extensively as I got older. I grew to appreciate that traditional art of metalworking called blacksmithing.
Yes.
And I guess a turning point in the history of my interest in blacksmithing occurred in about 1969 when I learned of a book. So the genesis of blacksmithing as we know it today started in the beginning. It started with a book, and it was a book called The Art of Blacksmithing by Alex Beeler. Alex Beeler was an advertising executive in Atlanta, Georgia. And he wrote this book in, I believe, it was copyrighted in 1969. And this copy I got from Alex. He signed it for Clyde Payton, who soon will be able to write his own book. With kindest regards, Alex W. Beeler, April the 16th, 1977. And I've read this book, by the way, cover to cover 2 or 3 times.
I can tell
Because-
it's showing dog-eared. That tells me you've been in it a bunch.
This is the original publication, the original copy or printed of this book.
First edition.
Since this same book has been reprinted, at least a dozen times down
Yes.
through the years.
Yes,
And it's still for sale
yes.
at the last time I checked, at the phenomenally low price of $10 a copy.
Really?
And I have bought several cases of these books down through the years to donate to FABA and give to friends and so forth. And it's the book that sort of revived the ancient art of blacksmithing in the United States. Because after World War II, blacksmithing as you and I know it today was virtually dead. And Alex Beeler saw fit to write this book in order to revive that and to kind of teach people the basics and most importantly the history and the romance of blacksmithing. So that book got it all started, really and truly.
When did you get your first forge after reviewing this book, after reading that book? How long did it take you to get you a forge?
Well, actually, I already had the rudiments of a forge. I called it a forge at least before that book. But I didn't start collecting prime blacksmithing tools until after I read that book. And I read that book about in the early 70s.
Yes.
Yeah. When that book first came out, the only blacksmithing organization that I know about was called the Tully Smith House Blacksmith Guild. And that was the first one, and it was in Atlanta, Georgia, and the site was the Wren's Nest, a little museum in a residential area of Atlanta called the Wren's Nest. And that was the home of Joel Chandler Harris, who wrote the Uncle Remus stories.
Yeah.
So I went to several, and Dr. Prather, I believe you accompanied me at one time
Yes, I
to
did.
Atlanta, Georgia.
To the Wren House.
Yes, to the Wren House. Anyway, that was the first organization of old-time blacksmithing that I'm aware of. And there, the first time I ever saw Alex Beeler, he was a demonstrator at a meeting I attended there. And later on,
Hello, everybody.
later on, there was another blacksmith who was Alex Beeler's son-in-law by the name of Ivan Bailey. He also did some demonstrations there. But the Tully Smith Blacksmith Guild was the only one that we could attend at that time. But when Alex Beeler's book got popular, there was an organization started called ABANA, Artist Blacksmith Association of North America. And that association got started in the early 70s. To be exact, I think it was 1972, I believe.
That's correct.
Yes. And it started at a little town in central West Georgia. The name of this little town, I forget. Lumpkin, Georgia?
Lumpkin and Westville.
Yes. Westville was the museum. Lumpkin was the closest little town. Westville, thank you, Dr. Steve. So, anyway, a group who had read Alex's book met there and started the national association called ABANA, Artist Blacksmith Association of North America. The first president of ABANA was a man by the name of Joe Humble. And I think Joe Humble was from Kentucky. And he was the first president of this organization for, I think about 3 or 4 terms.
Yes.
And Joe Humble, his first mission was to establish what he called chapters of ABANA. And the very first chapter of Urbana that Joe started was the Appalachian chapter of Urbana. Appalachian area chapter of Urbana was its correct name, I believe. And this was a group of about 3 states in the Appalachian area, and they were the first chapter. And Joe was very enthusiastic about starting chapters all over the United States. And Alabama and Georgia and Florida were 3 of the first states that started to form chapters. And at that time, Willard Smith was the president of Urbana, and he and I met in Tallahassee in the parking lot of where my office was located, and we discussed the business of organizing and getting incorporated as a nonprofit corporation in the state of Florida. And this was in 1985. So I filed the first corporate articles and bylaws for Florida as a nonprofit corporation in Florida in 1985. And at the time, I didn't know what I was doing, so I needed all the help I could get. I borrowed from Florida Special Olympics, I borrowed their corporate charter and bylaws as kind of a guide to go by and doing ours.
Yes.
And the person that I borrowed that from was a state director of Florida Special Olympics at that time. His name was Bill Crutchfield. He's been dead for several years. But anyway, I used his corporation's nonprofit charter and bylaws to go by in drafting ours. And it passed. I filed it with the Secretary of State's office, and they didn't ship it back to me postage collect, so I must have done it pretty good, I guess. Anyway, outlined in those corporate articles is a few fundamentals that kind of signifies what FABA is and is all about. First, it is a nonprofit Florida corporation. Our mission, so stated in the corporate charter, is to preserve and teach the old-fashioned art of blacksmithing. Secondly, it's a family organization. Family meaning Ma and Pa and all the young ones and Grandma too. I used to say, and Bozo too, but people insisted on bringing Bozo to the blacksmith meetings, and that didn't work too good, so I had to drop Bozo out of the family. But anyway, that's how we carry out our mission, is to preserve and teach. And we do that 2 different ways. To preserve, we're consultants to the Florida Park Service in the establishment of period blacksmith shops in the state of Florida. And by the establishment, I mean this. We restore, replicate, build from scratch period blacksmith shops all over the state. So far, we've built 20 in the state of Florida. Now, the next mission is to teach. And the way we carry out that part of our mission is that we have blacksmith meetings in Florida every weekend, just about every weekend, somewhere in the state of Florida, there's a blacksmith meeting going on that is in a Florida affiliate. And at those blacksmith meetings, such as we're having today in my shop, at those blacksmith meetings, we specialize in focusing on youth. That's another factor of our charter, by the way, is we're an educational institution with a focus on youth. So at these meetings, we always specialize in teaching, especially the young, teaching blacksmithing the old-fashioned traditional way. which, by the way of blacksmithing nowadays has very little changed since thousands of years ago. It's still done with iron, a hammer and an anvil, and a fire to heat it up. And that aspect hasn't changed one bit. So we can call it modern blacksmithing if we want to, or we can call it antiquated blacksmithing if we want to. Both are still the same.
But might I interject that really
Sure.
the difference between old time and now time is we have electrical tools.
Yeah, the tools has improved tremendously.
Now, speaking of tools, how is it that you got into collecting antique blacksmithing tools?
Well, there again, that started at a very early age. My grandfather, not only was he a farmer, but he was an excellent carpenter. He built churches, for example, and houses. And when I was about 7 years old, he gave me several tools, which I still have, by the way. And from that day on, I've always been interested in tools, what they could do, how you use them, how you care for them, and how you can abuse them. So tools have always been a fascination for me. And blacksmithing tools in particular have always been a fascination for me. And it was a fascination to the extent that I actually built blacksmithing tools and equipment for other blacksmiths for several years in my shop, namely forges. And the reason I got into that is because I could not find a good, real blacksmith forge that wasn't beat up, wore out, tore up, or busted. So I thought, well, I'll make my own. And I did. And I found out one of only two places that I know of in the United States that sells things like fire pots and tuyers and clinker breakers and ash dumps and so forth. That is an integral component of a blacksmith's forge. So anyway, I got started building blacksmith tools and equipment, and have built them right on up until very recently when it got to where it was too much work and I had to quit. But I still have one or two of those forges that I built, and people have always bought them. I never made any money on them because if I had sold them for a profit, nobody would have bought them. Because a good blacksmith forge, which lasts for several generations, by the way, the good blacksmith forge costs a lot of money to buy all of the component parts and the metal and the welding and the fabrication that goes into building one. They cost a lot of money and nobody wants to pay that price, even though the forge will last several hundred years if it's built right and taken care of. I hope that answers your question.
No, I thought you'd quit building because your collection of antique tools filled your shop so greatly you didn't have any room to do stuff in there.
I'm ashamed to admit the truth of that. By the way, I'm trying to sell some, so I'll be glad to load you up if you're interested.
I noticed that you were advertising the sale, and I was disappointed to see that, Clyde, that you're selling off your tools. But you can come to my shop anytime you want a hammer.
Okay. Another high point in the history of Faba, it started when a group of us met at a Madison Southeastern Regional Conference. We met there in 1985, and a group of us decided to incorporate in Florida.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we were kind of in competition with one or two other states that wanted to form, at that time, chapters of Havana. And those one or two other states was namely Alabama and Georgia, who was trying to incorporate at the same time. Now, being of a competitive nature, I wanted to be first in the Southeast to incorporate, so I was hot and heavy in competition with the state of Alabama. But after I got the corporate articles and the bylaws formulated I was in very much a hurry to get to the Secretary of State's office to file before Alabama did. And fortunately, when we first started, there was a group of about 30 some odd, I believe, met in Madison. And everyone there chipped in and paid their first membership dues of the grand sum of $5 a year to join FABA. And we also voted for Blacksmith board of directors, so to speak, for the Florida chapter of Urbana. It was named at that time. We later changed the name to the Florida Blacksmith Association. But anyway, all of that group but one, Mr. Ben Rogers, paid his $5 membership fee. And poor old Ben didn't have the money. He didn't have $5 at that time. I didn't know it, or I'd have given him $5. But he was the only one that didn't join. But we honored his presence at that beginners meeting anyway. And so even though he didn't pay his $5, we counted him as a charter member.
What we're going to do with all that money?
Well, it didn't take long to spend it. First thing we spent it on was a newsletter.
Okay.
I was reviewing some notes there. It looks like I've just about covered all of those notes. If either of you have any questions, I'll be glad to confuse as much as possible by answering them.
You've told us about the origins of the organizations. Let's go back to Clyde. Let's talk about Clyde.
I was trying to avoid that aspect.
No, that's mainly what we're interested in, but we appreciate the history of the organization of FABA and of BANA, but we're terribly interested in your progress and the things you've done in your shop and with your hands as a blacksmith. Tell us some of the things you've been involved in, some of the highlights of your hammering. One, making tools for other smiths. Obviously,
yes,
that's a highlight.
That was probably my very first fascination, was making tools. I love tools. I love making tools. Yeah, here's a picture of that group that first met in Madison, Georgia in 1985. I don't know whether your camera can pick up any details or not.
We'll take a picture of it
Yeah,
later
all
with the
right.
good camera.
But getting back to your question, Dr. Prather, some of the highlights, my church built a new sanctuary a few years ago.
Yes.
And they built a real nice choir loft, I call it, where you have to go up a series of 3 or 4 steps to get up to the choir area.
Yes.
And going up these steps, there was no handrail. No handrail in the church. So the deacons came to me one time, knowing that I was a blacksmith, and pleaded that I build 2 sets of handrails to go in the church. And so I set off to build a couple of handrails, and they're quite beautiful, I think. Very simple, which is one of the requirements for ironwork in a church. But anyway, that was one of the highlights, to be asked to build handrails for my church.
But that was very recent, within the last few years. You've been hammering iron 40 years before that.
Well, all of the iron that I did before that. Oh, by the way, I want to tell you about another thing I built for the church, and then I'll come back to your question. Another thing I built for the church was a window grill. Again, the church came to me wanting me to build a burglar bar for the church office.
Aha.
And so I told them right off I didn't build burglar bars, but I'd be glad to build a pretty grill to go in that office. And so I built a real nice grill to go in the church window. And the focal point of this grill was a cross. And the cross was a bright metal, and the rest of this window grill was black iron. But anyway, that turned out to be a spectacular piece of artwork, if I must say so myself.
I'll confirm that.
And it is still in the old church office. They've since built another church office, bigger and so forth. But anyway, that window grill is still in what is today the church's library, and it's still there in place. And I thought that was a highlight too.
Yeah, it was a marvelous piece. I have seen it, Mr. Payton.
Oh, well, good,
Yeah.
good. But to get back to your question, what did I do before that?
Yeah.
Mostly it was strictly utilitarian type blacksmithing. For example, I live here in an agricultural area in rural Jefferson County, and farmers used to bring me all kind of broken stuff, busted stuff, stuff that needed alteration, but mostly they brought me doggone bush hog blades to sharpen. And I hate sharpening bush hog blades because it is so work intensive. You can get a ruptured rotor cuff in a hurry beating out the metal that bush hog blades is made out of. But anyway, that was the mainstay of my forge for too many years.
That's okay.
Beating out a bush hog blade, first of all, they're made out of the toughest steel I think I have ever worked on in my life. But beating those things out, you have to heat them up in sections because they cool off too quick for that tough steel to be forged out sharp again. And that's the way you sharpen big blades like bush hog blades. You sharpen them by forging out a new edge.
Rather than grinding off.
Rather than grinding. But there's still a little bit of grinding you have to do, and I did it with a hand grinder. But that was very little grinding. There's an old blacksmith saying, if a fine edge you would win, first forge thick and then grind thin. So that's what you have to do with blacksmith blade, with bush hog blades if you're going to sharpen them.
Yeah.
You forge them down as much as you can by hammering them hot, and then you take a grinder and you touch them up.
That was obviously before you got a mechanical, electrified power hammer.
Yes, it was before, but even after I got one, I still had to sharpen bush hog blades. But I learned very quick, power hammers, unless you've got the right kind of a specialized dies in a power hammer,
Yeah.
power hammers do not work for sharpening bush hog blades.
Oh, you learned
Nothing
that the
but-
hard way.
I learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
Yeah, by messing up
few-
a pair of bush hog blades. But anyway, the best way to do it still is to heat them and beat them with a hammer.
Okay, good. Is it fair to ask you some major mistakes you've made? How many times you been burned?
You sure ask embarrassing questions, Dr.
Well,
Rather.
well, this is for the historic record.
Oh, well, if I might be flippant, I've been burned too many times.
You know, that's
but-
consistent.
You never learn not to get burned, I guess, because what little bit I work in the forge, I sometimes still grab a black piece of metal that's still too hot to handle.
You know, just because it's black don't mean it's cold.
Oh, no. So the best thing to do is to try to learn your hands not to touch black metal if you're working in a forge. Black metal, the law is black metal is hot.
Yeah, it is. Now, you've acquired a lot of blacksmith tools and things. Where did you get all that stuff?
years and years of scrounging yard sales and flea markets and old blacksmith tools.
Yeah.
I've got blacksmith tools that I collected from old blacksmiths, all of which now are dead. My dear wife's uncle was a man by the name of Newton M. Bagby, and he was a blacksmith for the Panama Canal agency in the Panama Canal zone
Yeah.
all of his life.
Really?
Yeah, for 40-something years, he was their lead blacksmith shop at the Panama Canal. Well, he made his own blacksmith tools.
I would hope so.
He made his own tools. And I still have several of his blacksmith tools that I bought right after Vi and I got married.
Marvelous.
Just before he died. Right after that, he passed away, by the way. But I bought some of his tools. Similarly, I have collected blacksmith tools from my grandfather and a lot of other old blacksmiths.
Yes.
Yeah, Judd Nelson, for example.
Yes.
And I've also collected a lot of blacksmithing tools from the Kenny Lynch collection.
Yes.
Kenny Lynch was a metal worker who also was dead several years ago. But Kenny Lynch collected tools. And when he passed away, he had warehouses full of tons and tons and tons of tools.
He didn't buy them one at a time. He bought them by the case and railroad lots.
He sure did. And if the factory didn't want to sell the tools, he bought the factory. He emptied it out and sold real estate.
Yeah.
Such was his fanaticism in collecting antique tools. And I'm very fortunate to own some of the tools out of his collection.
That's
So,
marvelous.
so anyway, resources like that are not present today. You do not find good old blacksmithing tools anymore.
You know, because the Clyde Paytons of the world got them all sequestered.
Guilty. And I'm glad I'm guilty.
Yeah.
I had the finest collection of anvils you've ever seen at one time. And I didn't want to just sell them outright. Every time I ever sold an anvil, I always suffered from postpartum depression. So anyway, I wanted these anvils to go to museums.
Yes.
So the first museum I sold anvils to was to a curator by the name of my Alzheimer's just seized my brain. Tim Chris was his name.
Ah.
And he had a blacksmith museum in Brycetown, North Carolina. And Tim Christ learned of my antique anvil collection some way or other, and he called me one day wanting to look at my collection. Well, he came down in a truck to look at my anvil collection. And due to his fast-talking, very convincing language, I parted with a truckload of my anvils to him, and I might add for a very fancy price. But he didn't bat an eye about paying that fancy price for a truckload of my anvils, and he hauled them back and put them in his museum.
Ah.
And it wasn't but a week or so later he called me again, and he wanted to buy the rest of them. So he came down and bought a second truckload of anvils. So that is one museum where most of my anvils are.
Is he not the guy that wrote a book on anvils?
Yes, he did. He wrote a book on anvils.
And I want to remember that your anvils were frequently pictured therein.
Half of the anvils in that book came out of my shop.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, he wrote a very fine book. I got a copy of the book in there. He wrote a very fine book about his anvils. But the next blacksmith museum that I furnished with tools was the blacksmith shop in Plains, Georgia, that belongs to the Carter Plantation Homestead in Plains, Georgia. And President Jimmy Carter was instrumental in getting the National Park Service to create a museum there, a museum of the Carter Plantation near Plains. So, the person that the U.S. Park Service hired to furnish the blacksmith was a professional blacksmith. His name was J. Reichert from Albany, Georgia. And he came down, J. Reichert came down and wanted to know if I could furnish that blacksmith shop and the cobbler shop museum with tools. Fortunately, I still had quite a collection of antique tools. So I happily complied in furnishing the blacksmith tools and the cobbler shop. This particular museum was run by a blacksmith, and this blacksmith for the old Carter Plantation was a blacksmith and a cobbler. And the reason he was a cobbler is because he had to keep all of the plantation workers in shoes, building shoes and repairing shoes for quite a cadre of workers on that farm, because it was a big farm. So he was a cobbler, in other words, a shoemaker, and blacksmith too. So they wanted to furnish that little museum with cobbler tools and blacksmith tools. Fortunately, I had a very good collection of both. So all of the tools that you see in that shop in Plains, Georgia, also came out of my collection.
That's marvelous.
So if you ever go up there, by the way, they bought a lot of cobbler tools and blacksmith tools, but only a sparse little handful appears in that blacksmith shop up there. I don't know what in the world the U.S. Park Service done with the rest of them, but all of those tools are not in that shop. I don't know where they are.
They might have found a place for them elsewhere in the United States.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Oh, this is marvelous. Tell us a little about your family. You mentioned Vi, and I assume that is Mrs. Payton.
Vi is my bride.
She's your bride, and I
And
want you to talk about your family a little. I understand that with 2 words, your son made you and Vi grandparents just recently.
just recently.
With 2 words?
Yes. First let me brag a little bit. My darling bride and I will celebrate our 55th wedding anniversary on the 29th of this month, 29th of August.
You really, she's put up with you this long?
That's what I'm proud of.
I'm surprised, but go ahead.
Yes, she's put up with me for 55 years.
Yeah, but she told me she was not renewing that contract this time.
Uh-oh,
She renewed it on the 50th.
uh-oh.
Like, I hadn't renewed Jean's yet either. So, y'all gonna have to straighten up if you want us to renew our contracts.
I'm gonna have to do a lot of praying, aren't I?
Ain't you though?
Anyway, yes. My oldest son, Bill, lost his wife to cancer about 3 years ago. And he recently got remarried. And he married a very lovely lady who had an adopted daughter, a daughter that she adopted when the baby was just a few months old. And it was adopted from Central American country. How come I can't? I told you that Alzheimer's had set in. Anyway, I'll think of the name of the Central American company in a minute, country in a minute. But anyway, she's a darling little child. pure Mayan, indigenous Mayan, beautiful little girl, long black hair. So I'm very proud of my little 9-year-old granddaughter. Yes.
Okay, and you have another.
Proud of Lee, mostly because of his fascination with art in general. He is really a grand artist, and also with his fascination with music. He's also a very good musician, piano and guitar, to be specific. But Lee is an assistant professor at a college in Chicago, Columbia College in Chicago. And he's starting his 6th year there, and he's home as we speak for summer vacation. But he goes back in about 2 weeks, he goes back up there to start his 6th year at that college.
He's notable. I recall seeing a DVD. Make sure I get the initials right.
It's a disc.
That he has recorded and edited that I thought was an
Yes,
impressive.
indeed.
So tell us about that. What he
Lee
did. Why did he do
Lee
it?
is the chief producer of this disc, a DVD, I believe they call it, and the co-producer is Columbia College in Chicago, and they underwrote the cost of the producing of it, and I've still got about 1,000 copies back there if y'all like 102 of them. But anyway, this is a documentary on blacksmithing, and in this movie, this documentary, he outlines first the ancient mythological blacksmiths, Vulcan, Hephaestus, and so forth. He outlines the beginning of blacksmithing with those mythological blacksmiths of Roman and Greek origin. Very well made movie, I might add. Very well made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I
What's the
have
name of it?
The Gods of Fire.
Okay.
Gods of Fire.
And
Yes.
Bill did that as part of his professorship at Columbia College.
Yes, that was all part.
Didn't they have a bit of trouble with the narrator?
No, they did not.
They mentioned in the narrator is the one and only Dr. Skeeter Prather.
Which is not the reason I brought that up, but I think that your son Lee did an absolutely phenomenal job
I
in
think he did,
recording the
too.
history of blacksmithing.
Yes.
Yeah. Now then, that's your family. Your older son lived in Washington State Northwest for a long time.
Yes, he did.
What did he do up there? I think it's important for us to know that.
Both of my sons graduated from FSU. Lee's got a MFA, master's degree, and Bill graduated there in geological engineering. And he was part owner of a geological consulting firm in Port Angeles, Washington, and did that for several years.
Yeah. I think that's important to your history and your family history, that he is a geological engineer with great field experience. What's
Yes.
he doing these days back in Tallahassee?
Well, in 1908, I believe, we had what the economists called a little economic depression in this country. And
We also had one in 2008, by the way,
yeah, what did I say?
1908.
I made the same mistake you did, didn't I? Anyway,
I'm the only one who lived through the 1908 one.
in 2008, that little recession hit, and geologists especially geologists connected with the building trades, were the first to go economic-wise. A geologist is the first one on the building site, but only after his expertise and testing soil and so forth can you turn the first shovel full of dirt on anything that you build on the face of this earth. So, that having been said, his firm kind of almost went bankrupt because they couldn't get any work.
Oh boy.
And because of that, mostly, he sold his part of the company to other members, other owners, and moved back to Tallahassee.
Yeah.
And he got his job in Tallahassee over the telephone, by the way. But anyway, he is now a landscape geologist, I guess you'd call it. And he does landscape work for the city of Tallahassee.
Ah, good. Good.
Yes.
Yeah. Huh?
So if you're ever on the section of the Capitol Circle, otherwise known as the truck route, that goes from Appalachia Parkway to Crawfordville Road, that is his specific beat. And he is responsible for every tree, every flower, every kind of grass, and every cultivation and nutrient aspect of those plants.
Now we've covered your, I would say 39-year history in blacksmithing. I won't add that up for the purpose of our recording, but we've skimmed across very quickly 39 your total blacksmithing history. What have we left out, Clyde? What have not we addressed?
Well, you've left out all the bad parts and the embarrassing
Well, I asked
parts.
you about those, but you refused to answer.
And I still refuse. I don't think we've missed out on anything of any particular significance.
Okay.
There's one thing that I'd like to emphasize.
Please.
I retired from the state of Florida when I was 60 years old. The last several years I worked for the state of Florida. I was an administrative hearing officer for the state. I did parole revocation hearings for youth in an agency called HRS. But anyway, that's what I did. When I retired, I took on a second vocation or profession, non-paying job. And that job was FABA, Florida Artists Blacksmith Association. And I kind of took it on full time.
Yes.
Because that was kind of a second love. Vi says it's my first love. Because it was a family organization. It focused on blacksmithing, which was always a fascination for me. And in focusing on blacksmithing, you had to involve tools, which likewise was part of my mania. So that pursuit kind of struck me right smack dab in the middle of my interest, my intellect, and my devotion. And I've been kind of devoted to that nonprofit, family-oriented teaching institute ever since.
Yeah, besides doing all the original organizing work to make it official, you have served several terms as president of the organization and other offices, as I remember.
Several offices on the board, secretary, treasurer, program director, president, just about all, vice president, just about all of them, I guess.
Historian for a season, you began to collect the archivable records. You began that, as I recall.
Also, I was the corporate registered agent for that corporation. Up until just recently, by the way. So I had to keep up with the filing of the renewing of the charter every year with the Secretary of State's office. And I did that for up until about a little over a year ago. And the reason I had to quit being the corporate agent is because they changed the filing of the Secretary of State's office from doing it manually, where I took it typewritten down and presented it to the Secretary of State's office. They changed it to filing online. And that left me out because I am not computer literate. The only thing I know how to do to a computer is unplug it from the wall. So anyway, I had to turn that job loose. Otherwise, I served in that capacity.
Since the origin.
Since the origin,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, you also are the author of a special scholarship that our organization offers. You want to mention that?
Oh,
I think of Walt
yes,
Anderson.
Yes. Let's see. The Walt Anderson Scholarship is a scholarship that FABA offers every year to a worthy recipient, whatever that means. I think everybody's worthy. But anyway, this award pays for their tuition to any of the leading blacksmith schools. We have only a few, by the way, but it pays for the tuition. And I believe that's about all it pays for, isn't it?
No, pays for travel and expenses
Travel,
up to $1,000
Yeah.
today.
But anyway, this is a long-standing scholarship that we've been providing for.
Who is Walt Anderson?
Walt Anderson was also a founding member of our organization,
Oh,
and he was a newsletter editor at one time, and he's been dead for several years. But anyway, he was a good blacksmith, retired military, I believe.
no, he was an electrical engineer by training,
Yes.
and he was with Florida Power for many years
Oh, okay.
as an electrical engineer.
All right.
I don't mean to correct you, but I just happen to know that.
Good. Well, thanks for the correction. But anyway, Walt was a very staunch supporter of FABA. Like I say, he was a charter member too. And he's been dead for several years. So in his honor, we call it the Walt Anderson Scholarship.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Payton, you've had a fascinating history. Oh, I want to meet you. You serve as historian for FABA. From you allowed that we needed to maintain the history, and you declared yourself the historian and would collect records. And of the knowledge that you're probably one of the two sources in Florida of a total set of the FABA newsletters.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, I have a full set.
And all that was because
Day one.
you're maintaining the history.
Yes. And I have back in my library, I have a big stack of those.
Yeah, in behalf of FABA, we say thank you for that.
Oh, well, you're welcome.
And also, finally, if we left anything out that you need to tell us, what do you want to say to the current members?
Before we get to his final, can I ask about the poetry, sir?
The poetry.
Poetry. Tell me about the poetry, because I think you're trying to get to a different part of people's brains a little bit, to get the other part of blacksmithing into people. Every time there's a question of brass tacks, Clyde comes along and says, "Don't forget the other part."
Yes, Dr. Reddy, I do have a poetic leaning, I guess you would say. And that poem that you refer to is in a book. It's in a book that I recently wrote called Of Sow's Ears and Silk Purses, a medley of the writings of Clyde Payton. And I wrote this book started about 3 years ago. But that's the poem is in this book here. I'll look it up and read it if you want me to. But I wrote that book. It's really a book of short stories, many of which have to do with the art of blacksmithing. And after I wrote that book and had the first copy of it published, I found out that I couldn't quit writing. I could think of more stories I wanted to add to it, more and more. And so I thought I'd write an addendum to accompany the first writing of that book. Well, lo and behold, I couldn't quit writing the addendum. And after the addendum got over 150 pages long, I decided not to call it an addendum, but to call it Book 2. So, Book 2 is now ready for publication. Here is Book 2.
Wow.
So, anyway, one of these books has the poem that you referred to.
But just in naming the clinker breaker, you resorted to poetry in some way. I didn't say that in a bad way.
Good point, Dr. Reddy. I forgot that he named the clinker breaker.
Yes, I named the clinker breaker many years ago. The first name of our newsletter editor was the Florida chapter of Urbana was the name of it. But anyway, after we got incorporated, we decided that we wanted to have our own name for our own newsletter. So Walt Anderson, by the way, who was the newsletter editor at that time, got a little committee together. And the charge for this committee was to come up with a name for the new newsletter. So I submitted the clinker breaker as a name for our newsletter. And that name was selected by the committee and offered to the newsletter editor and the board, and they chose to go with it.
And you got an award for that. A year's membership free.
Yes, as a matter of fact, you reminded me of that. I did.
Yeah, you
I got
did.
a year's membership. But anyway, getting back to the significance of that name, the clinker breaker is one of the vital components of a blacksmith's forge. The clinker breaker is part of the actual fire plot in a forge. It's located right down at the bottom of the fire pot. Now, the purpose of the clinker breaker is to break clinkers in the fire. Now, what is a clinker? A clinker is the non-combustible residue that's always left in a coal-fired forge. When the coal is burning in a fire in the forge, there are certain parts, dirt, for example, and the various ash chemical composites, such as sulfur oxides of various kind and ferrous oxides of various compositions. All of this stuff will not burn. So it melts and solidifies down in the bottom of your forge, down in the bottom, right where the air comes out. So after you have used your fire for a while, that clinker stops up the air. So you have to have some way to clean out that clinker so that your fire is revitalized and commence again to do its work. So there is a poetic significance between keeping a clean fire to create your work and that little part of that forge called the clinker breaker, which actually does the cleaning. In so doing, it establishes the veracity, the truth that is, of the fire and its purpose. It establishes, well, I forgot my train of thought again. You'll have to pardon my short memory. But anyway, the clinker breaker is an instrument of truth and purity. And it furnishes good results, just as a good newsletter furnishes good results and truth. So I saw the significance and the connection between a clinker breaker and the newsletter name. I hope that answered your question, David.
Yes.
And it is stuck, and it is a good name.
And it stuck.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Unfortunately, that does not translate very well to the rank and file person that's interested in blacksmithing. They don't understand what a clinker breaker is, and they don't see the significance of it.
You might
As
suggest to the editor of the clinker breaker that he republish the origin of the name. Why don't you do that?
The editor?
Yeah, tell the editor to republish the origin of the name clinker
Well,
breaker.
Dr. Reddy, have at it.
You run into that sucker, let me know. That's a good idea. I was reading the history, getting ready for this, and it was like, you know what? That would be a nice piece.
Skeeter, a minute ago, you asked me, what did I leave out? Not on purpose, I have left out one very significant attribute of our organization. Again, let me emphasize that our organization is a nonprofit corporation. It is a teaching institute, and it is family and youth focused, okay? Now, with that criterion in mind, let me review very quickly another attribute. We, as a teaching institute, are sanctioned by the Florida Board of Regents to grant an honorary doctorate's degree in metalwork, i.e. blacksmithing. And we have done that for many years now. Now, what this means is that we, a committee, a special committee that's in charge of formulating this award and giving it out to other recipients, we try to find a person who has contributed greatly to the preservation and practice of the old-fashioned art of blacksmithing. And in doing so, we have given out that award to, I forget the exact number, but it seems like about 9 or 10 different, eight different people down through the 27 or 8 years that we've been in existence since 1985. And if I may, I'll show you the picture of the very first recipient.
Be sure you define who's their first recipient there.
The very first recipient was a 90-something-year-old black man who lived in North Rural Jefferson County, and his name was Thomas Raines. And Thomas Raines was a blacksmith all his life in northern Jefferson County. And he taught blacksmithing to soldiers who was coming home in World War II. He actually taught them the skill of blacksmithing as part of a veterans rehabilitation or re-entry program. And he was paid by the federal government for teaching blacksmithing to blacksmith. And he remained a blacksmith up until he was so old he just simply could not pick up a hammer. And he had the most humble blacksmith shop I have ever seen in my life. As a matter of fact, he had an old Fulton anvil that he bought from Sears Roebuck back in the 20s. And his blacksmith shop, the forge was built on the ground, and he sat on a low stool to use his forge.
His anvil sat on the ground beside
And
him.
his anvil sat on the ground beside of him. And he had an old Royal blower, Royal is the name of the old blower, that he used. But before that, he used a bellows, which he made out of leather and wood, that he built himself.
Yeah.
But that thing soon wore out, and he found a second-hand blower. And then he connected a pipe from that blower into his fire pot in this ground forge. And the pipe is made out of tin cans. He cut the top and the bottom out of cans, and being a good blacksmith, he telescoped these cans together to make his pipe. In other words, he was very resourceful.
He's a blacksmith.
And the reason is because he was a blacksmith. He knew how to do it. But anyway, he is the very first recipient of that very prestigious award. And we're very proud of that award, and we hope that it never loses its significance.
Thank you, Dr. Payton.
Yeah, Dr. Payton is a recipient of one of those PhDs, and I apologize, Dr. Payton, for not addressing you formally, but on behalf of FABA and the editor of our Clinker Breaker, I say to you sincerely, thank you so very much for taking this time and reviewing with us your fascinating history and dealing with hot metal.
Well, thank you. My pleasure. And I hope I confused you significantly.
Off.
You confuse